received a knock on my door. Upon opening the door, there was two guys stood in front of me, and they basically surged forward and then carried out this frenzied, brutal knife attack.
Welcome everyone to Global Educators. This is a platform for educators and parents from all around the world to come together and talk about how to create a safe world for the next generation. This episode is about finding your purpose in life. If you feel lost, this is going to be an episode helpful for anyone that's out there lost and don't feel like they can't find their purpose in life. Now, today's speaker is a resilient survivor, author. He's here to discuss the importance of finding your purpose. He was on the edge of taking his own life, but thankfully did not, and instead decided to write a book. He is the author of Skip to the Good Bits, which made him a best-selling author, and now he spends his life to share his experience in hope to empower everyone to not walk a life that he had in the past and perhaps live a better life. With his help, you can truly experience a better mental health. So thank you, Mr. Darren, for accepting my humble request and agreeing to do this with us. Please introduce yourself.
My name's Darren. I'm obviously from the UK, and I was just an ordinary guy before my story began.
What was your career at the time when you experienced those tragic events?
I was doing two jobs at the time. We had very little money, so I used to have a job during the day and then one in the evening to earn extra money. We had a 1 year old son at the time, and so it was tough times. It was hard. So yeah, we had to do what we had to do to survive. From a financial point of view, and put food on the table. But yeah, so my job was I was basically doing delivery driving during the day and similar in the evening as well.
So let's do go back in those dark moments a little bit. What were some pain and sorrow and grief that you've experienced and that kind of motivated to you to write the book?
It probably been to start at the beginning, with what actually happened. So just for the people watching at the moment, it was on a Monday night at midnight. I received a knock on my door. My wife and 1 year old son were upstairs at the time, and I thought I'd overslept because, as I said just previously, I had two jobs. So I thought I'd overslept. You're going back sort of 29 years ago now, and we didn't have access to mobile phones like we do now. So it was a different era as well. So getting a knock on a Monday door at midnight wasn't necessarily the end of the world. Just it happened from time to time. So there was no fear or trepidation from me getting out of bed and going to answer the door. Upon opening the door, there was two guys stood in front of me, and they basically surged forward and then carried out this frenzied, brutal knife attack, where I received in excess of 20 stab wounds in my head, back, chest, and legs. So the wounds, although in my head I had seven stab wounds, but some of those stab wounds were where I was repeatedly stabbed in the same spot more than once. So it was more of a hole than a stab wound. So we don't know how many actual stabs I took. Um, but yeah, the one in my back was you could put your whole hand inside there. I had stab wounds in my legs, across my chest. So it was a brutal and frenzied attack. You know, from my point of view, there was no apparent reason for this. It came out of the blue, and then it was about then. From that moment on, the police turning up. I thought I was going to die. I had blood pouring out of me all over my body, and it subsequently turned out to be what they call a professional hit. It sounds like an American term, but it was a professional hit, but mistaken identity. I'd never been in trouble with the police before. Just as I said right at the start, I was just an ordinary guy trying to get through in life when this traumatic event happened. Now, going back to the sort of pain to purpose side of things, as you can imagine, there was quite a lengthy recovery period from this. And but I was 29 years old. I sort of dusted myself down and eventually got on with life, and but about 13 or 14 years after, which we now know is quite common. It happens in service people, people from the military. They can suffer a delayed response to PTSD, which is exactly what I did. And so, yeah, so I literally 13 or 14 years after the stabbing, I went through a bout of depression where I was on the edge of suicide. I knew I was going to take my own life. I knew when I was going to do it. I hadn't quite worked out how I was going to do it, but I'd worked out all the other factors around it because I just couldn't see a way forward for me. And back then, listen, as the years go past, it's got a lot easier for me to talk about. So forgive me if I don't sound too emotional with it, but yeah. So I went through this spell of depression when you know, I was so alone. And some of your viewers may know this feeling. If you've been through a trauma, and it doesn't matter whether it's a brutal stabbing like mine, it could just be a car crash, it could be, just losing a job. It doesn't have to be something so desperate. Um, but if you've been through a trauma and you're suffering afterwards, sometimes you're so alone, like really, really alone. And I had a huge circle of friends and family around me. I had a lot of support, but I was still so alone, and it was very difficult to explain, or it's certainly really difficult for anyone to see because why would they see it? They had loads of people around me. How could I possibly be alone? And the other factor was the feeling of being surplus to requirements. That, if I wasn't here, no one would care. That's the thought process I was going through. No one would care at all that Darren wasn't here. At some point, 1 week, 2 weeks, 2 months, people would move on. Life would carry on without me. So there was no point to me, and that's where I was at. Now there was a couple of little turning points for me. I received a random phone call from a friend who said to me, get to the doctors, speak to the doctors, and if you speak to the doctors and they'll offer you tablets, take them. And I was a tough guy, I was this normal guy who used to drink in pubs, and I was first at the bar, last at the bar. I wasn't going to take tablets because I was feeling a little bit sad, which is how I was seeing this. And that's where it sort of the world changed for me a little bit. It just literally I went to see the doctors. It was a big moment to actually, offer myself and my story to the doctors. So that was a very, very big moment. And the doctors were okay. They were brilliant at the time, but they didn't offer much help. And it was like every point I went through, there was no help. There was just no one there to try and say, give me a hug and just say, listen, everything's going to be all right. I don't mean my family and friends. I'm talking about the authorities, the system, if you like. There was nothing there in place where there was any compassion at all. And it just it compounded the feeling of that loneliness and that surplus to requirements. But nevertheless, I went to see the doctors. I spoke to the doctor. He gave me the tablets, and the tablets went around my house for months. I didn't take them. I didn't want to take them. I felt that if I'd have taken the tablets, I'd have been defeated. I'd have lost against a mental illness, which I thought I was big enough and tough enough to get through. So when you take all of that pain, and you're suffering it and you're living it, then there needs to come a turning point. There needs to be a realization that it can't continue. And for me, I was lucky enough to turn in a better direction. I received a random email via my wife about writing a book, and I then went on and wrote the book. And the book comes before the pain to purpose. And the reason for this is I wasn't an academic person. You could probably tell just by talking to me, I'm not an academic. I'm just you run a mill guy. And I sat down and spent 12 months writing my story, and pouring my heart into my book. There was times I just cried and cried and cried because I was writing everything down that was coming from my heart. It was how I felt. And I was also for someone picking up a book, you need to paint a picture. You need to give them information so they can smell, they can taste, they can feel everything in your book. And to do that, I had to revisit some of the stuff that I hadn't really thought about for many a year, and that was tough. So I wrote the book. I became a best-selling author, and you know what happened then was my book started to help people. I didn't write the book with that in mind. I wasn't going right. I'm going to save everybody. I just wrote the book. It was just a thing that I came across. I just decided to do it, but suddenly it was like people were using my story to change their world, to change their lives, and that's when I realised that my pain, my trauma, if I didn't use it for good, it's wasted. It's almost like I'm doing other people a disservice by not sharing it. It doesn't make me special. There's loads of people out there with lots of stories, incredible stories. But if we don't share them, how are we going to help? And so for a little while, I tried lots of different things. I worked with different charities. I was raising money, and I sort of went off in several directions with this aim of trying to help people. But it wasn't really a purpose. For a long time, it was just an acknowledgement of I had a bad story until I realised that actually, no, I really need to have a structure to helping people. A real determination and a structure and a system that I could go and save people. So I started revisiting my whole life story, and then more recently, I created a business called iTalk MH Limited, and that was the shift from pain to purpose because I set myself a goal of saving people. I don't want anybody going down that route I went, whatever their reasons. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm just an ordinary guy who's lived that experience, and that loneliness and that surplus to requirements is awful. It's If someone said to me, even now, you've got two choices. You can take the stabbing or you go through the depression again. I would take the stabbing all day long. The depression was 1,000 times worse than the stabbing. It was horrendous. And the other thing as well, it wasn't just my pain, it was other people's pain. It was what people started to see in me, the pain they could see in me, and they didn't know how to help. So their pain. Also, then you've got the pain I then inflicted on people because of my behaviour. The some of the verbal attacks, if you like, I carried out on people were just not nice. It wasn't me as a person. So yeah, so that was some of the pain that was prevalent at the time, and it carried on for a long time. We're not talking a couple of days; we're talking months, possibly a couple of years. Sorry, I rattled on quite a bit there,
Oh no, thank
but
you so
that's
much.
the story.
Thank you for the thank you for the back. Depression was worse than the stabbing. Why do you think a mental pain is worse than physical pain?
Again, I can only talk through my lived experience. For me, the physical pain, once they stopped counting my stitches at about 40, I think they stopped counting my stitches. So, my wound on my back, I had stitches inside as well as outside because they needed to hold it together. So, but that was always going to heal. That was, your skin, and as a human being, we're robust. So we can deal with physical situations. If you break an arm, you can put a cast on there or a sling. And it gets better. The body's great at that. But where we struggle sometimes is with the mental health, and it was the mental health that wasn't healing. It wasn't improving. It wasn't. If anything, it was getting worse. And also with my physical injuries, I could see improvement. I could see the wounds healing. Then I, went for a stage where the blood had all dried up on my body. So then the next step was like I had all the stitches removed from me. You know, then I could start moving my body again properly. You could see a progress. Whereas with my mental health, when I was going through that issue, I couldn't see the progress. If anything, it was going the opposite direction. It was just getting worse and worse. And that's why I'll always say that the mental injuries were far greater than the physical injuries because of that reason.
But let's say if someone's depressed and they're using alcohol as a band-aid, is this a good idea? or is this something that people should be avoiding?
100% avoid it. So I was a big social drinker. So I could go out, drink sort of quite a bit of alcohol over a period of an evening, but then I may not go out for 2 weeks. Yeah, but sometimes I could go out on a Thursday and a Friday. So there was no real structure to my drinking habits. However, when I was struggling, I found that I was my escape. I thought was my escape was going to a pub with people I knew and drinking because the subject wasn't about me. It was like a little bit of freedom from me. This was me escaping me. And what that led to then, we didn't have any money. Bearing in mind I had severe injuries. I had no work for a little while. So we were struggling and I was spending money I didn't have. So there's the first reason. Financially I wasn't in a position. Not everyone's in that position, but financially it was a stupid decision to do. Then because I've got, if you like, a high from the alcohol, from the social event. So being in a pub with people who weren't talking about my mental health, I then suddenly thought, oh, I could do that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And so what you then do is, first of all, for me, financially, I couldn't deal with it. I was just racking up debt after debt after debt. It then became, I wouldn't put me down as being an actual alcoholic, but it was very, very close to being that. I wasn't dependent on alcohol, but it was very, very close to that. And also then the drinking, I wasn't turning up for things. If I did turn up, I'd already be, half drunk. The impact on other people, my wife, my family, my friends. I was, yes, I was this sort of fun guy who was always joking and clowning around, but I wasn't inside. I was dying. I was dying inside, and the alcohol compounded that. And when you're not in a good place, alcohol will compound that situation. Alcohol can be a depressant. Now I can go out. If I went out this evening, for example, have a few beers, have a chat, have a laugh, but then I may not go out for another 1 week, 2 weeks. So it didn't last forever, but it was definitely a poor decision and something that I hadn't seen. It crept up on me.
I want to hear your experience. Do we need some level of pain in life to make us stronger?
Life can throw you a few curveballs, but some people's challenges and some people's pains, if you compare them to, 20 odd stab wounds, they seem insignificant, but they're not insignificant in that person's world. So someone could go to work one day and cut their finger on a paper clip, so but someone else could go to work and cut their arm completely off. Now, at that moment in time, that paper cut is the worst thing to happen to that person. Losing an arm is the worst thing to happen to that person. You can't compare the two. So, just for example, when you started doing this podcast, and you would have gone through an element of trepidation. You would not have. It would be points where you felt uncomfortable. You wouldn't have felt confident, and that could be your pain. That could be your pain. It doesn't. We don't have to compare it to mine. So I think every one of us at some point will suffer pain in their own way, and it's that pain. It's what they do with that.
Hmm.
you know does it become clearly, how you conduct yourself on screen now? You've learned, you've flourished. You can ask questions. Your confidence probably changed from when you first started doing it, and you probably feel much better with it. So that bit of pain, so you can now probably teach other people and coach other people on how to do what you've done. So your lived experience can become your purpose. So, and with me, it was, well, I lived through that depression and, the suicidal thoughts. So use that because otherwise it's just wasted. No one else is going to benefit from that. When after I've gone in years and years to come, is no one's going to, they're not going to look back and go, oh, right, that happened to Darren and think nothing of it. I want them to look back and learn from it and learn from what I did and my lived experience, and that's the important part. So I do think everybody will go through pain at some point. It doesn't have to be as extreme as mine. It could just be your pain, whatever your pain is. It may just be moving house. It may just be, that changing jobs. Sometimes these things are traumatic and really impactful on people's lives. And if you look at the education system, for example, growing up through schools, just changing the school, going from, I call them infant and senior schools. I don't know what they're called around the world, but that step up as an 11-year-old is a huge step for people, for young people. And that can be massive. It can be really impactful. So there's a pain there for that. Your parents could decide to move and put you in a new school. You know, that can be incredibly painful and traumatic. So pain is different for everybody, but I do feel we benefit from it, especially when we use it for good afterwards.
Wonderful, nice. So, victim
Absolutely.
mindset can be it can, drag you down into this rabbit hole. But what do you think are the differences between like playing the victim role versus like you're actually depressed and you need help? What's the difference between
Yeah.
like complaining versus like opening up?
Once again, it depends on your own state, your state of mind. So where you're at as a person. So I use the analogy from my point of view. My story is my story. I can't go back and change that. It happened. And what I done, I played that victim for many, many years. It was worries me, and oh, look what happened to me. The whole world should feel sorry for Darren Barden, and that was my victim mindset. That was me going, I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted people to just come to me and say, oh, what's happened to you, Darren, is really, really bad. But people have got their own lives, they've got their own pain. And so for me, that story, it was like an anchor dragging behind me. If you've got a boat and you're trying to sail a boat, and but actually you've got the anchor still down, you're just pulling it and dragging it and you're not getting anywhere fast. You may move forward, but you're not getting anywhere. Well, my story's still the same, but the story now is the wind in my sails. The anchor's up, and I use the same story to move forward and help others. So when we talk about the victim mentality, that is definitely a thing. Um, and when I opened up to people, I genuinely believe a lot of them thought that I was moaning. It was very much as you described. It was a case of, well, listen, it's happened. Get up, get on with life now. Dust yourself off. You know, you can't go back and change it. Just carry on. And that was other people's perception of what should happen because of the lack of understanding of how we are in our mental state. So yeah, definitely um, the the victim mentality is definitely out there. It's a case of, and this takes us nicely on to having a purpose that you can change that mentality, that victim mentality, into becoming a purpose by finding your purpose.
Nice.
And it's that side of things. And listen, everyone's different. Every one of us is different. I just use the analogy of, you starting a podcast or someone changing a school or with me writing a book. There's it's what you want to do with that, using that experience, using what you've got up there to go and do something, and especially do something you enjoy. Because I see a lot of people in a lot of environments who feel they've got to go and share this experience, feel they've got to, as opposed to wanting to. And that's a big factor as well. It's very much, you've got to choose something you love. You've got to choose something that you want to do and people you want to help. That then creates a purpose because it will never become tough. You'll never work if you're enjoying what you do.
During the process of writing your book, you mentioned about you had to revisit those tough moments, and that can be like really triggering, right? In parts of our brain, our amygdala, it's probably gonna shut down. And for like even like for me, like I try to just avoid difficult topics. Do you think the benefits or some like the value, the worth of revisiting? How did that shape your mind?
Listen, one of the things with depression is and forms of depression. You've got your anxiety, you've got severe depression. That sort of mental ill health, if you like. One of the things we always say is that you should reach out, you should talk to people, right? And we know that is true. We know by talking about your problems, opening up about your problems does help. However, when you're in that moment, it's not easy to do. It really isn't easy to do. And I know because I've been there with it. I know that the last thing I wanted to do was tell my friends and my peers I was laying sitting on the floor in the shower crying my eyes out for no reason. You know, and if you've been through this yourself, you know full well that you haven't got control of your emotions. You haven't got that control. So one of the things is when someone says to you, "Why didn't you tell me?" or "You should have spoke up," that was never going to happen for me, and it doesn't happen for most people. So there needs to be a point and almost like a safe space for you to do that. And for me, my safe space was when I wrote the book. I was on my own, but I was talking to thousands of people in my head. I was opening up and pouring out what emotions I had, and I think that was the bit that really turned things for me. And made my world a better place. Expanded my mind to know that I can talk about this. I just wrote this page. There's one point where and I write about this in the book that after the stabbing had finished, my wife come down the stairs carrying my 1-year-old son in her arms because she'd heard all the screams. And bearing in mind, this is just after midnight. And as she walks through the living room, her husband is sitting on the floor with blood coming out all over my body. And she's walking through puddles of my blood. Now, when now it's easy for me to talk about, I can describe this because I wrote the book and I do the talks. But when I first wrote that, the I had to write her emotion as well, and I didn't know how she felt. I had to try and put that across, and that really upset me. That was one of the things that really impacted me. What was her trauma for all of this? You know, so me pouring it out into a book form was definitely the thing that helped me because I then got that bottled up emotion and put it down onto paper. The next time when I was telling people about the book, before I published the book, it was very much along the lines of, right, oh, listen, I had to write about this bit today, and this is what happened. I was telling people that bits of the story that I've never spoken about. And so for me, yes, speaking up 100% is the best thing to do. What I will also say is that it's not always easy, and you will find your moment.
Are you really thankful for this opportunity that got to write the book?
100%. Like 100% for me, it was. So what happened with the book was my wife received an email at work, and it was for her boss, but it went to her email address. So she spoke to him and said it was about writing a book. It was a free book writing course, and she went and spoke to her boss, and she said, "Look, I think Darren could write a book." And he said, "Well, send him the email." So she sent me the email, and it was just a random moment. It was all a coincidence that she received this email. He sent me the email, spoke to me, and said, "Why don't you go on this book writing course?" It was a 1 day event or 4 hours basically, and I went and I just thought, wow, I can do this. This is going to be great, and that's when the process started. So for me, it was writing the book was a tough ask for me because I was not an academic. I didn't read lots of books. In fact, I hardly read any books ever back then. Now I read quite a lot, but it was tough for me, really, really tough to even start. And I knew I needed guidance with that. So yeah, so the process the of finding my purpose to write the book was one of those purposes. He's right. No, I'm going to get this done. And it took me 12 months. My book's not even that big. So but it was you have to give yourself time to go and do this, and that goes back to that purpose. I bet, Baker, I bet you've got a book you could write. I bet you could write a book. And I would read it, so I would buy it and read it for sure. But for me, it doesn't make my book better than anybody else's. It's my story and my experience, which other people can relate to, And that's what gives me the buzz. It's, every time I tell my story, I don't know how many listeners you will have, or people viewing this, is that there's always one that resonates with the story, that picks up on that loneliness, on that surplus to requirements feeling, that dark space. They may not understand the stabbing, they may not understand, how I was drinking and things like that, but there's always someone that picks up on those two things, that loneliness and that surplus to requirements. And if by sharing what I do can help that person, then that's the bit that puts a smile on my face. That's the bit that makes me happy. So there's no amount of money that you can get that will supplement helping other people and seeing other people empowered and going on to better lives.
What is your one last advice to anyone listening who's trying to find their purpose?
Something you love. Find something you love doing, and find something that is a service to other people. So it may be that you love playing tennis, as an example, right? So great, you go out, you play tennis, you get fitter, it helps with your mental health. That's brilliant. But find something that you love doing that is a service to other people, because there is no greater reward, and that will help you get through your space as well.
That's wonderful. What are some other ways you demonstrate? Yeah, how do you demonstrate your purpose in your life every day? And what are some services that you give to other people?
So if I was, a little bit of daily advice for me, yeah. So listen, I'm a big guy. I'm out of shape. I'm not fit as I used to be. Physically, I need to do a lot of work. But from a mental point of view, my mental health comes first. It needs to come first, because I will never go back to where I was. And, I've had a couple of situations through the years where I did slip back, but I spotted the signs. So to avoid that going forward is that, number one, take your time. Let's not be in such a rush to do things. Let's just stop and take your time to be grateful. You know, I try and advise people just before you go to bed, literally before you go to bed. So you've got into bed, you're laying there, you're ready to go to sleep. Just before that moment, just write two things down that you're grateful for that day. If you can do three, brilliant. And it could be as simple as a biro, ballpoint pen. You're grateful for having a pen because you can write things down. It doesn't have to be, oh, I'm grateful because of, I've got loads of money in my bank account, or I own a great big car. It can just be the simple things in life. But do that daily exercise where you write those things down. And what will happen is, as you write them down, when you write them, you mean them. And so by writing it down, you just write the three things down that you're grateful for. You can put the pad and pen down, and you can go to sleep. When you go to sleep, you're going to sleep with a positive mindset because you just wrote three things down that you're grateful for. You will sleep better and you'll wake up better. And that's a good starting point.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Darren. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and experience. And we're going to add all of the links to the books in the bio, in the description. So make sure to check this book out, and see you in my next video just like these.